I'm Phil Haun, and I'm here today to talk to you about my new book, Tactical Air Power in the Vietnam War, Explaining the Effectiveness of Modern Air Warfare. I'm a professor at the U.S. Naval War College, and so the views expressed today do not reflect those of DoD or any of its services. So let's get into it. Why tactical air power? Well, one of the main reasons is that for over a century, there hasn't been a air power theorist that provides a theory of tactical air power. I came across this many years ago reading Bob Pape's Bombing to Win, where he mentions the same thing, the course of air strategies developed without the benefit of an air theorist, though J.C. Schlesser came closest in the 1930s. But when you read J.C. Schlesser's Air Power in Armies, what you'll find is he argues instead of direct attacking enemy forces, an indirect approach, an interdiction campaigns, if you have to fight in a theater against an enemy army. And so this project brings forward a theory of tactical air power. The second question is, why the Vietnam War? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First, it's the first modern air war. And how do I define modern wars? I define them in two ways. One, and both have to do with technologies. The first was the introduction of thermonuclear weapons for multiple countries that significantly limits the scope or the nature of the wars that are actually fought. Typically, great powers fighting through proxies as opposed to another World War III. And the second technology is that of radar-guided surface-to-air and air-to-air missiles. What this does is it significantly increases the lethality of the medium-altitude regime. And what we see is a shift from the bomber to the fighter as being the primary combat weapon system in contested airspace. Yeah, another reason is that since the 1980s, what we've seen in North Vietnam is a number of studies that they've released, as well as some really good scholarship on what the other side was really thinking. That really has improved our understanding of the impact of air power on the North Vietnamese. And finally, it's the largest modern U.S. air war, stretches 8 years from escalation in early '65 until the end of combat operations in early 1973. And this air war, much of it, those who fought in it over Hanoi, you would find the same type of tactics being employed even today in the tactical ranges over Nevada and California. Here I list what I call the modern U.S. air campaigns since the arise of modern air warfare. And if you can see there's 23 cases here. 11 of them occur during Vietnam. And so a modern U.S. air campaign is against an opponent that has an integrated air defense system that can contest, at least on paper, can contest air superiority. And an air campaign has a strategy, whether it be a strategic bombing, air interdiction, or what I call a direct attack strategy. And so we see that not the majority, but still the plurality of air campaigns occurred during the Vietnam War. Notice also that there can be multiple air campaigns going on at the same time, an air war going on in North Vietnam, while simultaneously one going on in South Vietnam. And in addition, we see strategic bombing campaigns targeting industry and power going on at the same time as there's an interdiction campaign going on. So I do want to point out that in assessing these campaigns, couldn't do it all in one book. I'll get to that in a minute. What I want to talk about, if we just do a summary of these cases, we'll find out that of the 23 cases, 11, almost half, are direct attack campaigns where U.S. air power is being directed against an enemy army. Of those, most of them are militarily successful, achieving the military outcomes. Only in the case of, we'll see in Lam Song's 719 in 1971 with the Arvin's incursion, the South Vietnamese incursion into Laos, do we see a failure of air power there, as well as in 1999 in Kosovo. We see air attack against Serbian fielded forces is largely failing. Of those 9, though, that are military successful, 5 of those actually lead to political successful outcomes. So air power and direct attack works about half the time to achieve the political outcomes for which the wars are fought. We'll contrast that to strategic bombing, which only occurs in about a quarter of their campaigns, conventional strategic bombing. And of those, only 2 of those are successful. We'll see one of those with Linebacker 2 brings the end of U.S. Involvement in Vietnam. And the other actually is during the same time as Kosovo, their war over Serbia, we see strategic bombing leading to concessions made by Milosevic. As far as area interdiction campaigns, we also can identify 6 of those, so about a quarter of the cases. Those are the only success we see is in the early commando hunt, interdiction of the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos from late 1968 to early late 1970. All the others are largely failures. I said that I could only, this book covers only the Vietnam cases, but in another book released in 2021, also with Cambridge, we cover a number of the other U.S. air campaigns. Tom Hughes looks at Bosnia, Andy Stigler at Kosovo. We have Heather Venable, who looks at some of the Iraqi air campaigns, and Frankie Matisek looks at Libya. So if you want to look at chapter length assessments of other U.S. air campaigns, you can look at that. I also have an appendix that summarizes each of the campaigns that are not included in this book. Now, this book originated from a series of lectures I gave at the Naval War College and at Yale starting about 2013 on air power in the Vietnam War. This ultimately led to an article in International Security called Breakers of Armies, where the focus was on the Easter Offensive and Linebacker 1 and 2 in 1972 to January 1973. And the assessment there was that U.S. air power was decisive, but it was in the defeat of the North Vietnamese Army in a combined arms campaign during the Easter Offensive, primarily not in the Linebacker 1 interdiction campaign and then Linebacker 2. This book is a continuation of that research. Here's the table of contents, where I introduce a theory of tactical air power, which I'll go over in just a minute. And then the body of the book, I break down the American Vietnam Air War into different campaigns, roughly divided by the years of the campaigns. It breaks out pretty well there. I conclude with an analysis where I provide some operational and environmental factors that affect air power, as well as some so whats. What does this mean for the future? For those who aren't familiar with air power theory, I include in the appendix a chapter as well on that. And as I just mentioned, some analysis on the other air wars not included in this book. So with that done, let's get to it. The argument that I make is that air power or air forces are most lethal against enemy ground forces when they mass and when they maneuver. What we see is that when air power is effective, it deters armies from doing what they want to do. Their primary strategy is to concentrate at the decisive point, as Clausewitz would say. Because of that, an effective combined arms operation, it ends up placing the enemy on the horns of a dilemma. Do they disperse and hide against the air threat? That's actually what they tend to do. Or do they concentrate and maneuver against the ground threat only to be left vulnerable to the air threat. That's the kind of problems that an effective combined arms campaign can provide. And then how do we measure air power success? Well, it's not by counting the number of tanks that are killed. Instead, we look to see how air power has affected the enemy's, deterred it from its preferred strategy, forced it to make some tough choices that it otherwise wouldn't want to make. Another way to look at the impact of tactical air power is with this diagram that shows when ground forces are most vulnerable to attack from the air and what the reaction is. The circle in the middle indicates when forces mass. Forces can mass individually from an infantry to a tank. Tank is more mass than an infantry, but they also can mass in terms of size. And the larger the size of a ground force, more concentrated, the easier it is to identify from the air, and more efficient airstrikes are against a massed force. Second time forces are really vulnerable when they maneuver. Dynamic targets stand up against static backgrounds, either visually or with technology such as moving target indicators. And so ground forces are really vulnerable when they mass and when they maneuver. The other times are in the lines of operation or communication. Forces come into the field, or the supply lines that keep forces in the field fighting can be vulnerable to attack, as are lines of retreat. You can think about a hasty retreat where concentrated massed forces, unorganized, are retreating, are really susceptible to air power. So what do ground force commanders do under this lethal threat? Well, they tend to disperse and hide. They go to ground, they use decoys, they try to limit the ability to be identified and targeted from the air. Let's go ahead and go into the chapters. Chapter 3 covers the Vietnam War from early 1965 through 1966. We see really an acceleration of the war during this period of time. And we see the beginning of the Rolling Thunder air campaign in North Vietnam. It actually is two different types of campaigns. One is a strategic bombing campaign trying to coerce Hanoi to give up its support of the South. And then the second campaign is really targeting the transportation of the military forces to try to interdict those lines of communication and lines of operation. What we see in early 1965, after trying this gradual escalation, which largely fails, we see the strategic bombing through 1966 fails to convince the North Vietnamese to give up the insurgency, or even really to negotiate in good faith. Also, what we find is the air interdiction campaign, it fails to stop supplies. We see an escalation in the war in 66 going well. Initially, most of the interdiction is taking place in the southern part of North Vietnam, south of the 20th parallel. We see an escalation of that to the north in 1966, but this is primarily what are called armed wrecking missions, where a fighter bomber like a F-105 here is assigned to an area to look for rolling stock vehicles, military vehicles to attack directly. We don't really see a major escalation of the strategic bombing campaign until the following year. As far as what's going on in South Vietnam, in the summer of 65, we see a large number of ground forces being deployed to South Vietnam. And we begin to see major ground combat operations taking place in the fall. On the north side, what they are doing is launching an offensive into the Central Highlands to try to cut South Vietnam in half. That campaign is stalled by the U.S. offenses that largely defeats that offensive. Instead, what we see, the reaction of the North Vietnamese is that they tend to disperse and fight in smaller units. They move their headquarters and supplies back into sanctuary areas in the mountains and in Laos and Cambodia. And they adapt to firepower, and you can see this in their tactics. What they call their fighting is grab them by the waist and fight, which is a move as close as possible to U.S. ground forces in order not to be hit by U.S. firepower, whether that be airstrikes or artillery firepower. So we see in 1965 and 1966, air power being relatively effective in combined arms in the South, but having failed in independent air operations in the North. In 1967, we see again a major escalation in the war, both in the North as well in the South. In Rolling Thunder, we see in the spring of 1967 a strategic bombing campaign going after whatever industry and energy and transportation targets that North Vietnam actually has. Once again, this campaign doesn't convince the North to give up its ambitions to unify Vietnam. The interdiction campaign intensifies as well, but is unable to preclude the North Vietnamese who have decided on a general offensive and general uprising. Meanwhile, in the South, air operations have been relatively effective. However, North Vietnam doubles down with what is going to be known as the Tet Offensive, and this is kicked off with the Battle of Khe Sanh in January of 1968. Here's a C-130 aircraft delivering munitions to the Marine base along the DMZ in northwestern South Vietnam. Air power in terms of tactical airlift is going to be critical to keeping the Marines, about 5,000 to 6,000 of them, armed and fed during the 77-day siege. And what we see is in this battle, against the predictions of tactical air power that suggests when an enemy army is concentrated, massed, and vulnerable to attack that they'll disperse, we see instead the NVA, the North Vietnamese, mass 2 divisions against Khe Sanh in order looking for a decisive battle. In this war, what we see is it demonstrates the lethality of air power when enemy ground forces concentrate. These 2 divisions are largely wiped out, primarily a combination of airstrikes or artillery strikes, but most of those artillery rounds are actually airlifted into Khe Sanh as well. And so air power plays a role with that as well. Khe Sanh is unique. Khe Sanh and the Eastern Offensive are unique in the history of modern air warfare, where enemy armies are willing to concentrate even against overwhelming odds. And this is largely to try to gain political outcomes. There are 2 arguments for why the North Vietnamese go ahead and continue to mass their forces. First, the argument that is that it's a distraction for the Tet Offensive that's going to kick off right after the start of Khe Sanh. The idea that it'll draw out U.S. and ARVN troops while the broader attack is in the South Vietnamese cities. And the second, the one that the White House believes more so, is that the North Vietnamese are looking for a second Dien Bien Phu. They actually commit the 304th Division, an elite division that had overrun the French in 1954 against Khe Sanh. In the end, the Americans hold, the North Vietnamese are beat back. In the broader Tet Offensive, what we see is that there's a very limited role for air power across South Vietnam and the cities and the regional capitals. What we see is it's primarily police forces and popular forces that fight back and defeat the Viet Cong, which are largely wiped out. Their infrastructure is wiped out relatively quickly. Tet and the Battle of Khe Sanh are enormous military victories for the Americans and the South Vietnamese. But at the same time in America, it is a political victory for the North Vietnamese, because at this point in the war, what we see is that the Americans lose the will to continue fighting in South Vietnam. And what we see is President Johnson in March of '68 announcing a de-escalation of the Rolling Thunder air campaign in the North, seeking negotiations with the South Vietnamese, and his announcement that he won't run for re-election as president. That leads in to the next phase of the war. Many accounts tend to stop here and jump forward to the Easter offensive. But there's a lot going on in terms of air power between the Tet Offensive and the Easter Offensive. What we see is what becomes the longest air interdiction campaign in history, the Commando Hunt campaign, the interdiction of the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos with supplies leading down to South Vietnam. And so what we see in here what is a picture of an AC-130 called the Special Package. You can see on the chin of this aircraft some of the sensors that what becomes the modern AC-130 gunship, which is the #1 truck killer during the Commando Hunt campaign. And what we see here is in Commando 1 and 3, and these are seasonal campaigns based upon the monsoon seasons. 1 and 3 are in the dry season, largely the even number commando hunts. Very little happens because it's during the monsoon seasons, very rainy periods of time. And what we see here is that from the fall, really November of 1968, up to the spring of 1970, very successful air interdiction campaign. The NVA, the North Vietnamese, and the Viet Cong attempt to launch additional Tet, 3 additional waves of Tet offensive, each less effective than the time before, until finally giving up. And what we see is very few supplies maneuvering down into South Vietnam. The interdiction campaign is not very effective against the troop movements. They are dispersed and they effectively hike down the trail, but it is effective against supplies. And this is critical in terms of time for the South Vietnamese for 2 operations they have ongoing. One's pacification, the expansion of the President Tu, who's in Saigon, his control over South Vietnam, as well as what becomes known as Vietnamization. Americans training South Vietnamese, raising an army and air force to take over the duties that U.S. combat troops currently take place, so we can withdraw those American troops. This period of time is critical for stabilizing South Vietnam and raising its defense forces. So successful, in fact, that by the spring of 1970, the South Vietnamese Americans decided to do an offensive across the border into Cambodia to go at some safe havens that the Viet Cong are using. This incursion in the spring of 1970 is relatively successful. It cuts off the southern supply route from the Sihanoukville port. And so what we see is that the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos becoming increasingly important. So the operations into Cambodia, they do result in some political feedback or pushback for Nixon in the United States, but militarily they're relatively effective, cutting off the supply lines for the Viet Cong in the southern part of South Vietnam, in the Mekong region, as well as in Saigon. And that sets up the next chapter, which is Commando Hunt 5 and 7 in 1971 and 1972, leading up to the Easter Offensive, and the Lam Song 719 raid into Laos that occurs in the spring of 1971. Here we have U.S. helicopters getting supplies back at Khe Sanh, which is a U.S. base, supporting the South Vietnamese only forces that march into southern Laos in order to attempt to cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail and deny sanctuary. What we also see in the lead up to this is an adaptation by the North Vietnamese by increasing their investment in the Ho Chi Minh Trail, as well as increasing their air defenses. We also began seeing a downsizing the number of U.S. forces, so there are fewer attack air and B-52s conducting raids, but this is somewhat offset by increasing the efficiency of those ground forces or of those air forces with new technologies, more AC-130 gunships, new sensors, the Igloo White sensor system that makes the aircraft and the sorties that are there more effective. LOM 719 ends up being really a failure by the Allied forces for a combination of reasons. One of the most important reasons is that Congress has made a law by now such that U.S. forces ground forces cannot operate outside of South Vietnam. That means when the ARVN troops maneuver into Laos, they no longer have their military advisors or air liaison officers to coordinate airstrikes. And that proves critical in the battle, the inability to bring in U.S. strikes close to those forces. Also, the North Vietnamese decide, unlike in Cambodia, they decide to stand and fight. And the air defenses that they have, while not significantly effective against fixed wing jets and other high altitude aircraft, they're highly effective against the helicopters, which have been a workhorse for the U.S. Army and the South Vietnamese in South Vietnam. But they're not really ready for the high-level threat they find in Laos. The U.S. Army loses over 100 helicopters during this operation that lasts just several weeks, has another 600 of them damaged during this operation. So what we see is a failure of a combined arms operation. Even though there's plenty of U.S. air power, it's unable to be coordinated with the ground scheme of maneuver. And what this ultimately leads to is Hanoi making a decision for yet another general offensive. There's no illusion that there's going to be an uprising from the South Vietnamese, but there's this idea that there could be a military victory, as by now most U.S. ground forces have left South Vietnam. And that leads up to a much better known period of time in the war. Largely 1972, we have the Easter Offensive and the Linebacker 1 and 2 campaigns. Let's talk about the Easter Offensive. It kicks off a little bit later than the Americans thought it would, not until March. And what we see is the North Vietnamese have a three-pronged attack, the major attack coming across the demilitarized zone up in the northern part of North Vietnam in the Quang Tri province. We see another offensive that starts closer to Saigon, a major battle at An Loc, and then another attempt in the Central Highlands to divide South Vietnam in half that ends up in the Battle of Kon Tum. And the NVA, initially, they get a great victory at Quang Tri for a variety of reasons. I don't have enough time to go into all the reasons here. You can read them in the book. But one of the major reasons is that the South Vietnamese ground forces are largely inept, and there's been a changeover from a U.S. tactical air control system to a South Vietnamese. And the thousands of U.S. sorties and aircraft that come to the aid of the South Vietnamese, there's really no effective way to control them. Weather plays a major factor here. Here we have a B-52 on an arc light mission dropping bombs over North Vietnam. But we also see a significant increase in North Vietnamese air defenses, SA-2 SAM, such that the B-52s can't operate at Quang Tri. So the North get a victory. Fortunately for the South, it's in an area where they have strategic depth, where they can withdraw down to Hue, to the next province, and regroup. Meanwhile, U.S. and South Vietnamese have great victories at An Loc and Kon Tum, where they're outnumbered on the ground more than 3-1. Air power really comes in and decisively defeats those NVA ground forces. It's a combination of a relatively small number of troops that are willing to hold the ground, coordination between U.S. for airstrikes, and a willingness for the South Vietnamese to die on the ground in order to defeat the NVA. What we see beginning in early or late spring, early summer is a regrouping in the north. We have a new commander that's put into place, the Arvin. We see a new coordination. We bring in a U.S. tactical air control system. And what we see is the South Vietnamese systematically rolling back the North Vietnamese who really overextended themselves to Quang Tri. And then by September, we see a retaking of Quang Tri, and this really signals to Hanoi that they've been defeated, and they immediately come to negotiate at Paris with Henry Kissinger for the famous comments that Kissinger says that peace is at hand. However, Kissinger hasn't been negotiating, has not had the South Vietnamese in negotiations. We see them balk, and then it's not until after Nixon's reelection that we see a readdressing this. What we do see in the meantime, though, is the Linebacker 1 campaign, which is an air interdiction campaign in North Vietnam, kicks off in May as well. And operationally, it's quite impressive. What we see is large U.S. Air Force strike packages with targeting pods, dropping laser-guided bombs onto targets. They're taken out in a single mission that had taken weeks to try to take out during Rolling Thunder. But what we know from the assessments that have been declassified well after the war is that this never stopped the NVA from their offensive. They had pre-deployed their forces and their supplies, and so that deep air interdiction is never, it does incur significant costs and delay, but the North Vietnamese are really able to overcome that. Linebacker 1 is not what brings the NVA to accept peace terms. It's the defeat of their forces in the field. And then finally, Linebacker 2, which occurs also called the Christmas bomb, is in 1972. Nixon unleashes B-52s over Hanoi. And eventually we see the North Vietnamese coming back to the table once they run out of SA-2 missiles and they don't have the support from China or the Soviet Union to continue the fight. They accept a peace deal. But it's important to note it's the exact same peace deal they had agreed to back in September. Okay, some final comments. In the analytical section or conclusion, I identify some operational factors that have an impact on the effectiveness of air power. Air superiority is key. What we find is that the most important aspect of air superiority in ground battles tends to be against ground-based air defense systems. It's not air-to-air engagements. It's suppression of enemy air defenses, such as this wild weasel here. And we also see that small arms, man pads, it's very difficult to suppress those. Air-to-ground capability matters a lot as well. Having air superiority in and of itself doesn't bring victory. The ability to use that with the weapons, doctrine, personnel, as well as the coordination with ground forces is critical to being able to have an effect against enemy ground forces. And having capable ground forces matter, both in terms of their lethality, their ability to threaten ground forces, and their ability to coordinate with air forces. And finally, the enemy gets a vote. So you can have different quality of enemy forces. It's mechanized maneuver forces are a little bit easier for air power to actually identify and attack compared to infantry or guerrilla forces. How well an enemy army is trained to maneuver underneath the threat of air attack also plays a factor in how well you're going to do. But in addition to these operational factors, there are environmental factors. Someone who talks broadly about air power and doesn't put it into context, particularly in terms of like a campaign or a theater, really is avoiding some of the critical factors that the environment plays. Weather and climate plays a major role. It's difficult to see, you can't see through clouds, and reduced visibility make it very difficult to be operational from the air. Even those weapon systems that can be all weather at night, such as B-52 arc light missions or now GPS guided bombs, those strikes are only as good as the intelligence, the timeliness, and the accuracy of the intelligence that's provided. And quite often, that's visibility constraints can limit those as well. Climate, we see in certain areas like in Southeast Asia, monsoon seasons make an entire, battle rhythm is developed around those weather patterns, such as what we saw with Commando Haun. Day-night matters a lot. All things being equal, it's easier to fight during the day than at night. However, there's been a lot of systems, technology has been applied to this, developing systems such as the A6, the intruder for night strike, NVGs, targeting pods, and other type of weapon delivery systems that don't require visual cues have made it better now than it was then, but still, all things being equal, it's better to fight during the day than at night. Geography and terrain makes a big difference. And here I'm talking about vertical changes in the elevation can limit line of sight even from altitude, limit strike and the precision of strikes. But sometimes terrain helps. Really mountainous terrain can funnel forces into predictable routes. We saw this in southern North Vietnam during Rolling Thunder, the latter stages where the North Vietnamese really had to go through predictable routes to get through the mountains. Civilians aren't actually environment, but what they produce, urban type of terrain can make it difficult for strikes, as well as civilians being nearby can place restrictions due to collateral damage concerns. And so urban terrain, all the other things being equal, is more difficult for air than more open type terrain. And finally, concealment and cover. Concealment has to do with hiding from air, being able to identify, and cover is protection from air. And so variations, triple layer jungles, the ability to have ground that you can tunnel into, all can have an impact on what you can do from the air. I'll finish up with a so what. What does this mean for modern air warfare? Well, first is let's stop focusing on conventional strategic attack and air interdiction, and let's work on direct attack. Let's invest in those type of capabilities, the capability to locate, identify, and strike targets on the ground. Investment in seed versus air-to-air type training. Very few air-to-air engagements in the modern era, and those that do occur are on those strategic bombing campaigns, the ones that actually don't have much of an effect. One of the things that I think air leaders can get out of reading this book is an understanding of the operational environmental factors that can affect the effectiveness of air power, and the ability to work plans and an understanding of what's realistic in terms of what you can achieve, particularly if you're making an argument for air power alone. This book would make an argument against that. Really, combined arms is what you want. And if you're not willing, a nation is not willing to put their boots on the ground, then are the objectives really worth what you're trying to achieve with the use of violence? And then another push is conventional warfare is not dead. I was writing this book, some said, really, modern air power doesn't look like this. And then the war in Ukraine occurred, and maneuver warfare seems to be back. It seems to be back in Central Europe. And so we must be prepared to fight the joint fight if air power is going to play a major role. So that concludes this talk on my new book, Tactical Air Power and the Vietnam War. I didn't have enough time to talk about all aspects of it, but I hope this gets you to want to learn more about the Vietnam War, and as well as more about what are some of the limitations of tactical air power and how and why tactical air power can be effective on the battlefield. Thanks.